All right, thanks, Drew. And again, I want to thank everyone for joining in the webinar and taking some time to talk about how to help engage supervisors and middle managers in the safety process. As Drew mentioned, I'm a safety consultant for DEKRA. A little bit about me, so you know where I come from, is Iowa born and raised, and I continue to live in Iowa, reside in Spencer, Iowa. I've been in safety since 1999, and in that time, I've had various safety leadership roles. Worked as a compliance coordinator in a soy processing facility, worked in a hamburger production facility as a safety manager, manufacturing, where we built scissor lifts, an ag co-op, where I was a safety director for a multi-location facility. We had 20 locations, and I was also did a couple of years of loss control work for an insurance company until up until I came to DEKRA in January. I was a longtime customer of DEKRA, so very familiar with the company, and obviously a passion for safety, and worked with these folks for a long time, so it was a natural fit. So I also spent 3 years as a shift supervisor at the soy processing plant, which is where my interest in this role kind of started. I know I can relate to how busy these folks are, middle managers and supervisors, and it's a very challenging job. So prior to becoming a compliance coordinator, I did spend a few years as a shift supervisor. So what is your engagement level? Here I took a couple pictures after some training, and on the left, hopefully you're not like that dog. That was out in North Carolina. When I got done and I was wrapping things up, I looked and I said I didn't do a real great job on engaging my audience this particular day. So, and then on the right there's Stella. She's very attentive and was very engaged. So hopefully you're a little more like Stella today. As promised in the description, in this session we're going to talk about the critical role that supervisors and middle managers play in the safety performance of an organization. And you know, I do get concerns from various companies that they're trying to improve their supervisor engagement in safety. Some of their supervisors don't take it as seriously as they hope, and they just want to get them up to that next level. So what the things we'll address today is, what are the attributes of a strong safety culture? What does effective safety leadership look like? And what are the barriers that supervisors face on a daily basis that prevents them from being engaged in the safety process? We'll talk about some strategies that can help you empower your supervisors, like training and competency, hazard identification, risk assessment, and the hierarchy of controls, incident reporting, a systems approach, and then putting policy to practice, and conversation-based safety. So those are the things we'll touch on today. And like Drew said, if you have comments, we'll try to, or questions, we'll try to address those at the end. So who are the most critical employees to an organization? Is it the CEO, VPs, frontline employees, supervisors, lead persons, middle management? It's really all of them as far as an overall organization. But the thing we want to talk about is the critical role that supervisors play. I don't think anyone would argue that supervisors are extremely critical to getting the job done on a daily basis. So the challenges they face, you know, they serve as a liaison between upper management and frontline employees, and that can be a challenge. You're kind of getting hit from both ways as a supervisor. They're responsible for a lot of things like efficiency, productivity, quality, safety. They're dealing with people, HR issues, understanding and enforcing policies, managing personnel. I mean, it is a multifaceted role, and these folks wear a lot of hats. So they're often responsible for many of the required documentation. You know, there's daily documentation, forklift inspections, plant inspections, different quality forms that they need to make sure are filled out. These folks are the responsible parties for making sure that stuff gets completed and turned in. They're very heavily tasked typically in the operation, and they're the ones that ensure that the job gets done. on many occasions, that actually means they're doing it themselves. Somebody calls in sick, that job still needs to be done. Somebody, is injured and has restrictions or anything like that. They'll fill in here and there to make sure that that job gets done. So not only are they responsible for all the things up above, but they're typically sometimes doing the actual work itself. Supervisors juggle many priorities daily. I'm not telling you anything new here. We just want to summarize kind of how important this role is and how challenging it is and why it's hard to get them engaged sometimes. They're rewarded. What are they rewarded for in your organization? Oftentimes hitting production marks, profit and loss statements, quality goals. Obviously, these are all important business benchmarks. We have to, people are in business to make money. Some organizations, though, are hyper-focused on these, and they need to be cognizant of that. What message does that send? Make sure that on top of the 3 bullets up above, you're including proactive safety indicators as benchmarks as well. Bottom line on it is, if you want to engage your supervisors and middle managers, you need to be engaged. And I'm assuming I'm talking to mostly an audience of safety professionals and managerial folks. You need to be engaged in the process, and they need to know that it's authentically important to you. That's quite a term there, authentically important. But it needs to be authentic, and they need to know that it's important to you and that it's something that you value. Some examples of proactive safety measures. Percent trained. You have various safety training topics that have to be done on an annual basis. How many of your folks are trained? Recordable investigations done on time, near-miss investigations or audits completed, corrective actions closed within the month, incident entry goals, proactive incident goals. When I say proactive incident, an example of that that I used in my past is we had a proactive incident where we just wrote down, what did you see that was wrong and what did you do about it? And so there was just 2 narrative boxes that they would fill in and say what they saw was wrong, whether it was a behavior or a condition, and what they did to try to remedy that. So these are some proactive things, examples of proactive measures, rather than relying on lagging indicators like incident rates and injury rates. These are things that you can do and get out ahead of things and record those benchmarks. This all speaks to the culture of the organization. So what is safety culture? You get a lot of different opinions and definitions of safety culture. Safety culture is a key foundational leading indicator for workplace safety. It's the beliefs, attitudes, traditions, and perspectives that drive employees' motivation. A lot of people say it's what your employees do when no one's watching. I also like it's what speaks without even having to say anything. So what is it that you do on it, and what are the expectations at your facility? That's what safety culture is. So if we're going to engage the supervisors and middle managers, you have to spend time with them. Okay, if you want to engage this group, you got to invest some time. Start by scheduling a meeting or a series of meetings, and then we're going to want to address the things that were in slide number 4. Like, what are the attributes of a strong safety culture? What does effective safety leadership look like? And what are the barriers that you faced on a daily basis? So you get in front of this group and you start asking some questions. It needs to be an interactive session. It's more focused on listening to your supervisors and middle managers. In order to help engage them, you really need to find out where they're at and what are the barriers they face. Or maybe they're even just perceived barriers, but we need to get it out on the table so that everybody understands, and you can create strategies going forward. Obviously, you want to calibrate their definitions with well-established definitions of strong safety culture and safety leadership. So an example of that, Google is a beautiful thing. I Googled attributes of a strong safety culture, and I found an article in Industrial Safety and Hygiene News that was put put out by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Leaders demonstrate a commitment. This is 9 attributes or traits of a strong safety culture. Leaders demonstrate a commitment to safety in their decisions and behaviors. Issues potentially impacting safety are promptly identified, fully evaluated, and promptly addressed and corrected. All individuals take personal responsibility for safety. The process of planning and controlling work activities is implemented so that safety is maintained. Opportunities to learn ways to ensure safety are sought out and implemented. A safety-conscious work environment is maintained where personnel feel free to raise safety concerns without fear of retaliation, intimidation, harassment, or discrimination. That's a big one. People need to feel free to report things. If they're not, then you're not learning everything and improving like you should be. Communications maintain a focus on safety. Number 8 might be the biggest one on here. Trust and respect permeate the organization. That's a really key trait to a strong safety culture. Individuals avoid complacency and are continually challenging existing conditions and activities to identify discrepancies that might result in error or inappropriate action. So those are really good ones that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission came up with, traits that indicate a strong safety culture. What is effective safety leadership? Again, during your session, ask your supervisors, how do they define an effective safety leader? You'll be surprised when you ask these 2 things. What's a strong culture? What's a strong safety leader look like? These folks know the answers. And when you have an interactive session, they're going to give you a good list of what that means. And you'll find out that they pretty well understand what that is. Dr. Dominic Cooper wrote an article in the Professional Safety Journal about effective safety leadership. And what he stated is that effective leaders have a balance between caring and controlling. And under caring, he mentioned involving everyone in safety, showing appreciation, genuinely trusting people to do the right thing, listening to those they supervise and act on the information. And under controlling, he said setting clear direction, clarifying expectations, accountabilities and responsibilities, and setting improvement targets. So those are really a couple really good definitions of safety leadership and strong culture. So the other thing when you're having a session with these folks is you don't want to have another boring safety meeting. I've got a coworker that does an actual presentation on no more boring safety meetings. In order to engage people, you have to make it interactive and fun. So we utilize, when we do training, our consultants at DEKRA, we use Turning Technologies response cards. They're little clickers for short that we use that can really be effective in getting honest answers to tough questions. They can also just be, they can just break up the monotony within a presentation where you ask what's your favorite football team or things like that. You just keep them engaged. Here's some examples of some clicker questions that we've used. National VPPA was founded in what year? And then you get the answers. It's a polling that happens live, and then you show them the answer. You can also do contests within it. Who's the fastest responder? And it'll tell, you can actually keep this anonymous or you can assign it to people, and it'll tell you who answered the question the fastest. Minimum oxygen permitted for a confined space entry. Anybody know out there? 19.5. So these are just examples of questions that you can throw out, and obviously you can ask even tougher questions. Or what is your opinion on this? Or what are the challenges you face? And give them multiple choice answers or options. And it just keeps the session interactive and fun for them. So another thing that we do, A lot of times you're in a session, we tell people to shut off their phones or put them in silent mode, right? Well, we get kind of some anxiety with that as anymore in the U.S. People want to be looking at their phone. So here's an idea that you can use. Have them get their phones out and have them download some apps that are pretty cool. There's an OSHA app that gives you basically all the regulations. There's also a heat index app or a heat app where you punch in the temperature and the humidity, or you can either just share your location and it'll look it up for you and tell you what the heat index is and what you can do to prevent heat stress or heat stroke. Decibel, SDS Mobile, 2016 Emergency Response Guidebook, your local state's DOT or road conditions app. So there's some ideas to try to keep the session interactive and fun and not so boring. Okay, so safety culture. Do you want to go to the next level? Find out what your employees' perceptions are. So how do we do that? At DEKRA, we have what we call the Dekor Survey. And this survey is put out to just get employee perceptions on safety culture at your facility. So it provides average responses to questions based on perceived level of agreement. It's a Likert scale, that 1 to 5 Likert scale, 1 being the lowest answer, 5 being the highest. And obviously you're shooting for a 5 on all the answers. So lower scores on questions, categories, and averages represent opportunities for improvement. Higher scores obviously are the preferred condition. And we kind of give you guidelines on what requires immediate attention, eventual attention, and when you're at world class. So let's look at the categories that are in that survey. You see here, we've got our 2019 Dekor Survey database average in the column on the right. The categories we have, control questions. Those are just questions to make sure that we're getting honest answers and that it's a valid survey. So if people answer, if they just start drawing on their little bubbles, we know it, and we'll throw that survey out because it's not valid. So we do have some control questions in there to make sure these are valid surveys. Safety training and safety fluency tends to be the highest scoring on our Dekor surveys. Safety systems, policies, and procedures. Employee ownership, engagement, and involvement for safety. Performance management. Employee empowerment. Risk identification and control. Communication questions. Workplace systems. Production over safety. Management ownership and involvement in safety. General cultural questions. Supervisor ownership and involvement for safety, and safety department functionality, and reporting and investigation. So you can see that the overall average with all of those is 4.26 in 2019. So these are just categories that we, each category has a certain amount of questions, a total of 60 questions in the survey. Typically takes 15 to 20 minutes. It's not written in any complicated terms. It's a fairly easy survey for employees to complete, but it's a good way to get a feel for what your employees' perceptions are of your safety culture. As you see, supervisor ownership is always toward the bottom. So that's why we're having this webinar today, and why we've kind of developed a model to use, with supervisors and middle managers to try to help get them more engaged. Some of the answers on the surveys could be uncomfortable. Nobody wants to get low scores. Supervisors can feel a little picked on if they end up down there at the bottom. Like we said, they're very busy people. They have a very important role. So when they see they've scored low, that's not fun. So some of the answers could be uncomfortable, but how do you improve what you don't know? That's why we do these surveys. You want to find out the truth, and you want to come up with strategies that can help address it and make it, better. So another part of the session, if you schedule one of these sessions, is you definitely have to address what are the barriers that supervisors face daily. Have them write it down. What are the challenges they face as it relates to safety? You have to get it on the table so strategies can be developed and corrective actions can be put in place. So do an exercise. Here's an exercise I've done in the past that really helped me formulate strategy. Have supervisors and middle managers write down their strengths and weaknesses. As it relates to safety, what topics do they feel knowledgeable about? What areas do they think they need more education? Me personally, when we did this exercise at one of my previous facilities, I felt like fall protection was something that I was lacking as even a safety manager, that I was lacking a full understanding of. So that was one of my goals, is to improve on my competency on fall protection. We have the supervisors write all their strengths and weaknesses down, and from that we could delineate what are some areas that we could get some training for these folks. And that's important that they get that. They have a lot on their plates. So do safety processes add to their plates, or do they take away from their plates? They've got a lot of paperwork, training, those kinds of things. And for a supervisor, that can feel like you're giving them more stuff to do. So what we're trying to do is to help them and empower them so that it's easier, more efficient to do that, and also try to help take things off their plates. It's very important when you do this to focus on the why. So why do we do all this paperwork, and why do we do the training? Make sure you include that in any of your training with these folks. They need to know why we're doing it. There's usually a reason. Safety rules, policies, procedures. The old saying is they were written in blood. So things have happened in the past that have made these regulations, requirements necessary. And we need to focus on that why. Help them understand that they're tools, not rules. Think of a couple of common permit processes: confined space entry permit and hot work permits. Yeah, those are rules and they're policies, but they're also very effective tools. Confined space entry, if you go through a comprehensive permit and it's based on the OSHA standard, you fill out the permit and you do everything on that checklist, you are going to have very minimal to no risk involved in that entry, because it guides you through the process, and if there's something that's not right within that checklist, you don't go in. Okay, hot work permit is the same way. So those are examples of tools, not rules. One of the other things that I've done in the past that was a very effective tool for me is strategic planning. I read an article, and I can't find it to this day. I tried to circle back and find it. It's been several years ago. That effective safety programs, most companies that are successful in safety have a 3 to 5 year strategic plan for their safety process. So I would recommend trying it. Build it to suit your company or facility. Set realistic target dates on action items and update that regularly, because from personal experience, I can tell you that it changes. You'll set a date for something and you get to that date and you're not even started. So you need to push it out a little bit. But it does continue to give you guidance, and you refer back to it regularly. It keeps you focused on what are the things you need to do to improve the safety at your facility. So here's what I did. I focused on some key areas. One of them was competency. So as you see, I've got 4 circles around the competency, and you build this to your, to your facility. The safety manager, that was me. As I mentioned, I wanted to improve on fall protection. So one of my circles that I attached to that was take a fall protection competency session and training program. And I gave myself a date to complete that by. The supervisors, we used that exercise I told you about where they put down their strengths and weaknesses. And from the weaknesses, we could do one-on-one sessions with them where we focused on theirs, or we looked at, there were some common themes, and we set up training to make sure that those supervisors were able to get that competency training and feel more comfortable on the areas where they felt they were weak. The other thing we found was some of the things that folks put down as strengths or where they felt strong. We actually did send a bunch of our supervisors to a week-long fall protection training, and they found out that what they thought they were strong at, they weren't really strong at. They came back and said that they didn't even understand all the concepts involved with fall protection. So it was a very effective training for them. Executive employees, production employees, everyone has improvements they can make on their competency. I was at a facility where they had an amputation in the past, and it was because of technical aspects of lockout tagout, where not every energy source, gravity being the key thing, was locked out. So they had forgotten to block out something. So and an individual's finger got pinched and amputated. So write down your different roles and where their competency can be improved. Facilities, unless you have a brand new facility, almost any facility you work in has improvements that can be made. So whether they're electrical, machine guarding, maybe it's automation or ergonomic lift assist devices that can be put in the system. There's always improvements that can be made. Some of those are bigger ticket items and need to be budgeted and need capital projects and need paybacks and things like that. So it's best to get them out on paper, and that's why this is a 3 to 5 year plan. You're not going to do these things overnight. So get it out on paper and try to prioritize and try to be helpful with your bean counters to make sure that everything can be done and accomplished and according to priorities. The other thing is programs and policies. Review your policies. There's a reason OSHA makes us do it annually. Are there issues with your lockout tagout? I just mentioned a technical aspect, and that one company ended up having an amputation because of it. Do you really forensically go through those procedures to make sure that they're adequate? Okay, onboarding, that's one where a lot of people struggle. They throw an employee in front of a video and that's their orientation training. Can you have a more effective onboarding process? That includes some hands-on training and some job shadowing, things like that. Workplace violence, we hear more and more about it. It's one of the top causes of fatalities at work, believe it or not. It's usually top 3 or 4. So have you had some active shooter training or workplace violence training? Do you even have a formal policy? Things to consider. And then conversation-based safety. We'll talk a little bit more about that here coming up. So things that maybe you don't have, programs you don't have that can be considered and possibly implemented. And then culture. Setting expectations. Toleration. One of the things that we fought at one of my previous companies was we had gone a long time where we just kind of tolerated variances from safety policies and procedures. Okay, at some point, everyone has to come together and say, hey, we recognize that we've tolerated this through the year, but it really is an expectation that we do this the right way. And from here going forward, we're not going to tolerate it anymore, and we need to execute this properly, whether that's a lockout tagout or confined space entry, whatever it might be. Focus on the whys with everything you do. As we've mentioned before, it's important to understand why we're doing these things. And then positive reinforcement programs. We're really good at pointing out the things that we notice that are wrong. We're not as good at doing the positives. So we'll talk a little bit about that in the conversation-based safety portion as well. As it relates to supervisors, these folks are sometimes expected to enforce rules or procedures that they don't even fully understand. So that's where that competency is extremely important. In order to empower them and engage them, they need to fully understand these things. And so you may need to continue to develop them and get them more training. They need to have that adequate level of competency. So what is safety? Sometimes we look at lagging indicators, lack of accidents or injuries. That can be achieved with luck. So what we're trying to do is take luck out of the equation. Safety is continually reducing risk based on well-designed controls and knowledge about the potential for harm. And basically, safety equals action. It's looking out for each other and using our natural human attribute of caring. And we all understand that safety is extremely important. So when it comes to hazard identification, risk assessment, and exposures, exposure is created by a lot of factors, and it's when the people interact with the equipment to do their job. An exposure-based safety system is one that understands, influences, and changes the working interface for greater risk control and safer outcomes. Okay, so what methods do you utilize? And this is something that you want to talk about in your session. How do you proactively identify and eliminate or reduce risks? You use JHAs, JSAs, pre-job hazard analysis, etc. Whatever it is that you use, talk about those, and do you effectively use them? Or do you need to change something so that you're doing a better job of assessing risk prior to jumping into jobs? So here's an exercise you can do when it comes to hazard identification, risk control. And I did this at a session and it worked pretty well. It'll provoke some comments and some thought and discussion, but give each supervisor a 3x5 card. Have them write down the answer to this question. If you had to predict what your next injury or what the next injury in your department would be, what would your prediction be? That'll get them thinking. And if they can write down an answer to that and have a prediction, the question is, what are you doing about it? Because you've just identified a risk that you know is there and you think could cause an injury, and the likelihood or probability is the highest one in your head. So what do you do about it? It's just a fun little exercise. Also, make sure that the supervisors and middle managers understand the hierarchy of controls. And many of you are probably very familiar with this, but we talk about it during the session. Elimination is the most effective, substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and then of course the last line of defense is PPE. Here's another look at it where you can see exposure focus and employee focused controls, elimination, substitution, engineering controls at the top, and then administrative controls, personal protective equipment, gimmicks, incentives, hollow threats, being the least effective to the most effective. And you can kind of see on this slide that the bottom three in the red, those rely on the employee to do. The elimination, substitution, engineering controls does not rely on an individual's behavior. So that's why it's the most effective form of control. So hazard assessments, risk assessments. Here's a kind of a look at a spreadsheet where you write down the task, you look at the severity, what's the worst thing that could happen with this particular risk, and then what are the probabilities, the frequency of that happening, and you come up with scores, and then you can look at your controls to see if you have adequate controls to reduce that risk. If not, you need to implement some. So we would talk about that, and if you have a session like this on your own, you definitely want to make sure that you talk about hazard assessment and how to reduce risk in your facility. So here's a look at a trailer with some brick on it. If someone's going to unload that and doing a pre-job hazard analysis, there's a lot of concerns, right? Ergonomics, lifting, those kind of things. Let's watch this and see how they handle this. I got to throw some fun in here to keep you awake. So the other thing we want to talk about during a session like this with our supervisors is incident investigations, a systems approach. So how do you investigate incidents or near misses or any kind of variance? Too many investigations are very insufficient. What we will discuss if we would come out and do a training for your folks would be the best practices in performing incident investigations. You want to do those based on potential outcomes, not just the outcome that you have. Okay, what is the potential? We'll talk about significant injury and fatality exposures, or SIF for short. You want to have some sort of a methodology that you use to get to true root causes. Some of the common ones are 5 whys, Pareto chart, fishbone, etc. The 5 whys, I was just at a facility and doing a proposal, and this is a facility that has over 400 employees. It's heavy manufacturing, and they have great results. They've gone years without recordable injuries in a facility like that, which is amazing. When they have a near miss or a actual incident, they split their 5 whys. They do a 5 whys for the people or the person that made the decision or got injured or whatever it might be. And then they also do a 5 whys on the system. What is it that we could have done to prevent this as a company? There's generally always a system component to any incident or near miss or variance. It's too easy to blame a mistake and call the investigation complete. There's usually a reason for that mistake. So you need to go deeper when you're doing incident investigations. And we'll talk about that in a session. We'll talk about the traditional safety triangle. Everybody's probably seen Heinrich's traditional safety triangle, where if you have at-risk behaviors at the bottom, you have a certain number of them, it leads to a certain number of near misses, ultimately another number of recordables, then maybe more severe lost workday cases, and then obviously the big one, the fatality. Okay, the theory was if you eliminate all those things at the bottom, you're going to reduce your risk of having a fatality. There's been a lot of studies and things recently that debunk that theory, or at least update the theory. The safety triangle is not predictive. Not all injuries have serious injury and fatality potential, but you can see that a reduction of injuries at the bottom does not necessarily eliminate that risk of a SIF. So 21% of those things at the bottom have the potential to be a significant injury or fatality. So what are we doing about those? We need to make sure that we're putting those to the top of the pyramid and making sure that we address those first, and we have controls that prevent those, the 21%. So even when you're doing a near miss, you want to look at the potential. Did that have potential to be a SIF? And if so, you should address it as if it was a SIF, and you should make sure that corrective actions are in place and you fix that issue. These are things that we talk about with the supervisors and try to help with their engagement level. Last but definitely not least is communication. Okay, believe it or not, not all supervisors get into their role because of their communication skills or their positive communications. Many of them could benefit from soft skills training, and that's what we try to do with this conversation-based safety piece. We discuss conversation-based safety, which is a process that focuses on positive reinforcement for employees that work safely. So we're looking for the good things. We want to talk to supervisors about looking at their employees, watching what they're doing, and when they see them doing things right, go over and give them a high five and tell them good job. You know, reward the things, the people that are doing things right, instead of just finding the folks that are doing it wrong. Okay, and that's something that is an interactive session that takes some time, but conversation-based safety, we want to create that culture where people look out for each other while they're working. Okay, and it's not paper forms. It's if you see something, you say something. Okay, so on the other end, if you see somebody doing something at risk, you want to stop them and ask them why and help them, help coach them so they don't repeat that. Okay, and this increases conversations at the frontline level, non-formal conversations where risk identification is at the point of attack. And then there's barriers that can be identified and corrected within this conversation-based safety process. When you see somebody and they're doing something unsafely and you ask them why, and there's a reason that's out of their control, that's a barrier. So we want to make sure we address that. Traditional old school safety cultures is typically focused on the person. Motivation by avoidance, it's based on rules and regulations. It's failure oriented. So when somebody violates a rule, we address it. When somebody has an injury, we address it. When there's a property damage, we address it. It's all based on failures. It's usually management owned and driven, generally looks for unsafe acts to punish, and people work safely because they have to. The conversation-based safety culture is a little different. It's focused on accomplishment, emphasis on behavior, not conditions. It's success-oriented, as I mentioned. You're looking for the positives. And in that, when you start having those positive communications, people work safely because they want to. And it does become self-sustaining, and it's a different approach. How can we help in this process? None of the things I've told you today are things that you can't do yourself. You can use these strategies and develop these things and have these sessions with your supervisors on your own. If you're interested, we can also help with this. We are consultants, so and we have a module. We've done this for some of our customers already, where we come out. So if you have an interest, we can work with you to create a plan and a proposal. A lot of the strategies we discussed here today can be utilized, addressed utilizing our services. We have our Insight VIA system. It's a safety management system that helps with incident investigation, safety programs, the conversation-based safety, training. There's a lot of different things, a lot of different tools within our Insight VIA system. Obviously, we do the consulting, so we can come out and do safety consulting. We have adaptive BBS. We also help folks with their formal behavior-based safety programs. We have a system that will track the data for you and give you some really good reporting functions, feedback channels, risk removal, those kind of things. So we're set up to help you. And the process for that would be an initial discussion and proposal for service, a discovery period where we have a conference call or a go-to meeting to establish a plan for the training. This is also good timing for a Dekor survey if that's something that you're interested in. Because from the discovery period, what we want to do is customize a presentation and develop that based on the information we get from you, whether that's the Dekor survey or what we identify in the calls to address it. We'll review the presentation together to make sure we're all on the same page before we would come out and present it. And then obviously we deliver that training to your supervisors and middle managers. Typically that's a 3 to 4 hour training session. That can vary depending on what that discovery comes up with. It could be longer. I don't foresee being able to cover all that in less than 3 hours, so I'd say 3 is probably the minimum. And then we help you create action plans. When we leave, we want you to have some key action plans that can help with this whole engagement process. And then, of course, we continually follow up to ensure that that action plan is being implemented and putting policy to practice. So we've done this for customers. It's worked really well. We think we can do it at a reasonable cost for you. So if you're interested in some of that consulting, we can definitely help. So that really concludes the content that I have. I do want to open it up for questions, and we'll bring Drew back in if there's already been some questions so that we can try to address them.
Yeah, so we've got a couple questions here. And also at this point in time, if you do have any questions that you have throughout the course, go ahead and open up that questions panel and type those into there, and we'll get to those. So our first question is, do studies show that safety message retention is better when given in smaller amounts and more often, or fewer larger safety sessions?
Well, I don't know about studies, but I do know from personal experience. I'll give you an example. And Drew, maybe you could mute yourself because I hear a little background noise, and then we'll bring you back in. I do know from personal experience for me that retention is better in smaller chunks. So I'll give you an example. We used to, at one of my facilities, we used to do a comprehensive annual audit where we would go out and we'd audit every safety program. And this was a pretty daunting task, and it was overwhelming for the supervisors, location managers, and it was a full day or two of auditing and going through paperwork and that kind of thing. I felt like that wasn't being an effective tool. obviously we did identify things and try to get them corrected, but it was overwhelming. So we started doing target audits where we would just go out and look at one program. So for instance, lockout tagout, we would go out and we'd have, you know, maybe 20 questions on a audit based on lockout tagout issues. And then we would interview employees and interview the supervisor and look through paperwork associated with lockout tagout. And it would typically take 2 to 3 hours, and we would be out of their hair. And, you know, obviously you didn't address anything else but lockout tagout, but it was very effective, and they seemed to retain that information a lot better, and it was a much more effective tool. So to me, from experience, I don't know about studies, but the smaller chunks and the more often you can have you know, the training and do it in smaller chunks is more effective. All right, Drew.
The next question is, should we promote creativity when putting together a safety meeting when you have multiple locations doing their own, or dictate from the top what should be covered, how, and when?
I do think promoting creativity is great because, like I said, for instance, you go through a safety training several times. If it's the same PowerPoint, you're just not going to get as much out of it the third time you see it versus the first time. So promoting creativity, I definitely think you should do that. As far as whether you should dictate from the top what that training looks like, I think there's a balance. You need the content to be accurate, and it needs to be effective material. So from that standpoint, you definitely need to make sure that whatever presentations they present at different facilities is the right material. However, I do think that you want to empower these folks to provide that training in creative ways and in ways that maybe aren't conventional, that can get the attention of employees. One of the strategies I've used in the past is we sat down with a topic and I just asked everyone in the room their understanding of the topic. And when we went around the room and everybody kind of shared what they understood about the topic, by the time we got through everyone, we had covered the topic pretty well. And obviously then I've been in safety a while, so I could circle back and touch on things that maybe weren't touched on, but there's a balance. So make sure the content and material is adequate and accurate, but then allow some creativity and empowerment for these folks to do their own thing. You know, they can bring in content experts, bring in your state troopers, bring in your folks from medical field that can talk about, you know, soft tissue injuries, things like that. There's a lot of things that can be done to help enhance training and turn it more into education than just training. So I hope that answered your question.
All right, we've got another question here. What if you're starting a safety program from scratch? EHS is new as a formal process. How do you build the buy-in for doing something they've never been expected to do before?
Well, that's a great question, and you really have to kind of use stories from other folks. You know, first of all, there's regulatory requirements that require us to have safety programs. So there's a big why. I mean, we want to make sure that we are complying with federal regulations, state regulations at a minimum. Okay, so when you go through those policies, it's pretty easy to identify why they're there. So you want to make sure you focus on the why, but you just have to recognize and let them know that, yes, we haven't had this in the past, but we're changing it now because we want to improve and we want to make sure that you're safe and that you're going home healthy each day. So we are going to implement these processes. We want your input. We want you engaged. So let them participate in it, but you definitely need to establish the why. So, but I was at a facility yesterday where we covered a topic and the manager said, you know, I just haven't done a great job at this and I'm going to change. That's what he told his folks in the middle of the meeting. So that was, that's an eye opener. And that's where, toleration we talked about before as well. Things you've tolerated in the past, at some point you say, now it's the point where we're changing that. So.
Well, that wraps up what we have for questions right now. We want to thank everybody again for taking the time to attend today. Like I said at the beginning of the webinar, there will be a recording sent out within the next couple days. So this recording will be sent to you in a link, an email you'll receive with the link to the recording. Corey, thank you for taking the time to go through this with all of us today. And with there's nothing else, that kind of wraps it up.
Drew, I'll just mention that you can see my contact information if you're interested in just having a chat about possibly going through with a training like this. Just shoot me an email or give me a call. Thanks for attending.
Thanks, everyone.